Welcome. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous people of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands, which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and the mistakes of the past, and to consider how we are and can each in our own way try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of the OHA Judges Committee online virtual judges update. Thank you everyone for joining in and participating. This evening we are going to cover the topic of invasive species, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what to do if we run into some of these plants on the show table. And I do have a little extra information on a couple other sort of plant groups that if we venture into that area, we will cover it. So I'm going to share the screen and bring up the first slideshow. Okay, so this evening we're going to cover off invasive species. And in particular, we're sort of focusing on this as being an education, as we as judges are educators. That's an important part of who we are and what we do. So I've worked with a number of people from the committee to pull together the background information on this. It's a little bit dry, but somehow that's just the way some things are. The first thing that comes to mind is, what does invasive mean? There are a number of definitions out there, and what I've pulled together is ones that we should be aware of. First of all is the definition from the Province of Ontario's Invasive Species Act, and it's a species that is not native to Ontario or to a part of Ontario and is A, harming the natural environment of Ontario or the part of Ontario in which it is present, or B, is likely to harm the natural environment of Ontario or a part of Ontario, regardless of whether it is present in Ontario or in a part of Ontario. A very legal sounding definition. If we look at OJS, we will see that it is maybe a little more easy to understand definition. Plants introduced by human action outside their natural past or present distribution, whose introduction or spread threatens the environment, the economy, society, including human health. There are a number of good resources to find out information on invasive plants, and throughout this slideshow we have provided the various websites. Here's a couple other very similar definitions. One is from the Ontario Invading Species Awareness Program, which is a partnership between the Ontario Federation of Hunters and Anglers and MNR. And the other one is the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, which I think some of us are maybe a little more familiar with. And both these definitions very, very similar. The first one is from the Government of Canada. Invasive species are plants, animals, and microorganisms introduced by human action outside their natural past or present distribution, whose introduction or spread threatens the environment, the economy, society, including human health. So all of these definitions are very similar. Whoops, a little too quick, sorry. Now, in Ontario, under the legislation, under the Invasive Species Act, I just wanted to clarify, we have prohibited invasive species, of which there are only 5, under the plant category. We're not going to talk about animals, microorganisms, etc. There's whole lists of invasive species. We're going to focus on plants. These are the 5 plants that are considered prohibited under the Act. They are all water plants, not ones we're apt to come in contact with in our flower shows. This is the list of restricted invasive species in Ontario. Up until January of this year, there were only 4 plants on this list. As of January, they have expanded it, and there are now 10 restricted invasive species. If you scan down that list, you will see some of the usual culprits we're all very familiar with: black dog strangling vine, giant knotweed, Himalayan knotweed, Phragmites. So these are the restricted invasive species which are found under the Ontario regulation, and it's now called Regulation 702/21. Now, there are a number of other plant species in Ontario that can be a problem if they have the opportunity to move out of our gardens into natural habitat. And they have been identified by groups such as the Ontario Invasive Plant Council and the Invading Species Awareness Program. And we'll go through a few of these lists. I'm not going to go into detail on each and every one of them because I think most of us are familiar with them. And if you do go to the websites that are quoted here, you can get all the details about their growth habit and where they grow. But here's 3 common ones that we're all pretty familiar with: miscanthus, goutweed, and periwinkle. These additional plants that I'm going to list are ones that we as an organization and as judges and as gardeners should be really discouraging people from sharing with others, especially at plant sales. And as gardeners, we should have control plans in place to prevent their spread. A number of these plants, yes, they can still be purchased in garden centers and in nurseries because they are not named and they are not prohibited from sale through legislation. But as judges, we can educate others about the concerns about these plants. So I'm just going to go through a quick list of some of these. And as I said, the purpose of this slideshow is to give you some resources you can go back and go into more detail on. The plants listed here are from the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. That's the group that puts out Grow Me Instead as well. The ones in red are ones that are on the restricted list. So those ones are covered by legislation. The rest in blue are all ones that have been identified as being of an invasive nature, of concern, but they are not legally named yet to the legislation. We're all familiar with buckthorn, garlic mustard, giant hogweed, canary grass, purple loosestrife, good old Norway maple. And what the main common feature is of most of these plants is they were all introduced, the majority of them, as ornamentals in gardens, dating back to the 1800s, the early 1900s. These all were put in gardens, and what we have found now is, yes, once they get out of the gardens and they get into the natural habitat, they can cause serious problems. Garlic mustard, hogweed, lily of the valley, purple loosestrife. That's just to name a few. And we all recognize that they all have the potential to cause harm in the natural ecosystem. www.invadingspecies.com. I've taken these pictures from their website, and they have lots of detailed information. We're all very familiar with the Ontario Invasive Plant Council publication, Grow Me Instead. This is the Southern Ontario one. There is also a Northern Ontario guide. And if you go on their website, you can pull up Grow Me Instead. And this is an excellent teaching document to help people at plant sales, in your societies, if you're giving talks, just to give them an idea of what can you grow instead? What is a better alternative to some of these invasive plants? The Ontario Invasive Plant Council is a not-for-profit organization. It's been around since 2007. They have representatives who see the need to coordinate a provincial response. They are working to provide leadership and expertise, and to provide the government with the information that they feel is necessary to educate people through management practices, training, workshops, working with municipalities, landowners on specific invasive plant topics. And we're all aware of the work that we're doing, and I'm not sure who on the board is currently our OHA spokesperson with the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. This is another excellent guide, which is the Invasive Species, the Invasive Terrestrial Species Plant Guide. This is put together in conjunction with a number of groups, and it very similarly lays out some of the plants that we should be very concerned with, and we should be both educating ourselves and others with. Now, their list is similar. It has a few more plants on it than OIPC, but again, the ones in red are the ones that are already restricted under legislation. The others are ones that people are starting to realize are becoming a concern, depending on where you live, what soil types you have, what your environment is, how easy is it to spread. Again, I think we're all very familiar with things like garlic mustard, giant hogweed, goutweed, good old Himalayan balsam, and knotweed. Continuing down their list, there's a few here: Japanese hedge parsley, spotted knapweed, wild cheveril, wild parsnip, all plants that in the wrong place can cause serious problems. Dog strangling vine is one of the ones that is restricted. Oriental bittersweet, which was introduced. Kudza, again, most of these were all introduced as things that might be nice to grow in the garden, things that were brought over with the settlers from Europe, Eastern Europe, and are now we're finding are causing problems. A number of them were brought from Southeast Asia, again, brought as ornamentals. Huge list of trees and shrubs: good old Manitoba maple, Norway maple, whole municipalities. There was a huge program not that many years ago to plant Norway maples. They were brought into Europe as a substitute for the elm after the Dutch elm disease went through. So these have been introduced. They were thought to be a good replacement plant, but now, this many years later, we are now finding that things like Norway maple are very, very invasive, and they do choke out all our native maples. Winged euonymus, Euonymus alata, very common one. You can still buy that one in the garden centers, as Norway Maple is still available, Russian olive, Japanese barberry. Now, here's one of the really good resources is the Ontario's Invading Species Awareness Program. So this is a really good source. If you go to their website, they do have a lot of really good information. There's also the Ontario government. If you go to e-laws, you can get the Invasive Species Act 2015. And Regulation 354.16 was the original regulation number. It's now known as Regulation 702.21. How can judges, what's our role as judges? Well, we have a role. We can help educate show committees and show chairs by being knowledgeable about these plant species that are of concern. We can provide information on how these plants can harm the natural ecosystems and show ways to reduce the potential harm by these plants. We can encourage show schedule writers to write in their show schedule rules about not using invasive or invading or aggressive plants on the show table. We can encourage our societies to have educational exhibits to help members understand the threats of invasive and invading plants. I mean, how many of us got goatweed from a plant sale? Right? At the time, no one thought it was a problem. It was a lovely ground cover to fill in under trees where nothing else would grow. We now know goatweed, not a good idea. We could also encourage our plants to get speakers to speak on topics such as invasive plants, growing native plants, having tours of native plant nurseries, that type of thing. We do have a really strong role as educators. We're often looked up to as being knowledgeable when it comes to horticultural and plants. So let's talk this topic up and become educators. And one of the things we can do, and we talked about this last week, was if your show committees need some help with their show schedules, offer to review it, offer to help them make sure that they do have written into their show schedules things that they don't want to see on their show tables, and we don't want to see as judges either. If you look at OHS, we do have a general rule under OHS on page 14, and it includes harmful, poisonous, and invasive plants. So, people writing the schedule, if they are using OHS, do realize that there are things that they should be outlining in their show schedules. Part of the problem is here. When we published OHS, there were only 4 plants on the restricted invasive list. There are now 10 as of January 1st. So it's kind of important that people understand that this is an ongoing process, and as time goes on, there will be more and more plants. So we need to help work with our societies. On the show table, we show up, we have to remember that we don't disqualify entries. That's the responsibility of the show chair or their designate. We always have to consider that the schedule is the law of the show. We are hopefully making every effort to make sure that shows and show chairs are using OHS in writing their shows. And we as judges are the ones who can encourage them to use OHS, and we can help them interpret it. We're all pretty familiar with OHS. We pick it up, we know the page numbers, we know where the information is. Not everybody is as handy with an OHS as those of us who deal with it all the time. So here's a hypothetical. What do? We show up at a show. It's a horticultural class. It has grasses in it. You take a quick glance at those grasses, and lo and behold, there is a sample of Phragmites, potentially somebody who doesn't recognize what it is and what the concerns are. So here's some ideas. We should check the schedule, see if they do have a rule about invasive plants. First and foremost, if there's nothing really clear in the schedule, get the show chair over, get the head of the passing committee if they're there, identify it as a restricted invasive species, and find out if the society has a policy on showing a restricted invasive species. Chances are someone brought it in, put it on the table, nobody really noticed what it actually was. But we do have that obligation as judges to bring that to the show chair's attention. Let them decide if they want to remove it from the table. If they choose not to, if they don't see this as a problem, well, it's not listed, it's a nice grass in bloom. If they leave it on the table, then as a judge, you may need to, as we say, set it back. We are not disqualifying it. We are just saying, okay, it's not going to be a winner, and not consider it for placement. We need to take the time to add a note to the entry tag and give a reason why it wasn't considered. And more importantly, we need to talk to the show chair and ask them if they would like some feedback regarding dealing with invasive species, if they would like some assistance in figuring out how to put a restriction in their show schedule that will prevent invasive species from coming forward and showing up on a table. So let's look at one more question. What if you have a design class and it's entitled Along the Back Road? It's a fall show, it's lovely. It's a wayside design. You look at one of the designs and lo and behold, it has plants such as purple loosestrife and buckthorn as a greenery. These plants are listed in the publications from the NGOs as being invasive, but they're not on the Ontario restricted or prohibitive list. What do we do? Again, the old check the schedule. Does it have a rule about prohibited plants? Do they have a list that says which plants they do not want to see used in the show, and in particular, maybe in the design section? Again, bring it to the attention of the show chair or the passing committee and say, do you have a rule? Do you have a policy? Let them decide if they're going to leave it or not on the show table. If they leave it on the show table, then you've got to base your position on what are its merits under the elements and principles. The materials used may not be ideal, but if they aren't prohibited, look at the elements and principles. You could take the time to add a note to the entry tag and just mention some of the plant material used is of concern from the perspective that it may be invasive in nature. And again, let's educate the show chair, the passing committee, see if they'd like some feedback regarding educating their members on what maybe shouldn't be shown, and again, offer to review the show schedule to help out the show committees. This is especially important in smaller societies who may not have as much expertise as others. Larger societies have the benefit of more judges, more knowledge, more background, but sometimes the smaller societies don't. I'm going to just leave this slide up. We're not going to go into this unless folks really want to. There are some other plants that may show up. Cannabis and noxious weeds are two of them. But right now, I am going to unshare this, stop sharing this show for now. And if we need to, we can come back to it. And Kat's there. We've got, we've got 71 people on. I'd like to have everybody mute for now, and we're going to try and use the hand signals. So we had a lot of crosstalk last week and we couldn't hear people clearly. Any comments or points you would like to expand on dealing with invasive species on the show table? And
there's a couple in the chat.
Okay, let's start with the chat.
Diane Shute is now the OHA rep for the Invasive Plant Council.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much.
That there is a native Phragmites.
Yes, there is a native Phragmites.
And the question was, can it be differentiated from the invasive ditch one? Really, it's the main thing on that, as I understand, is the height. So
it's the height.
If you've got the cut station, there's not a whole lot that you can tell. So
yeah, that is true. And I guess when in doubt, we give the competitor the benefit of the doubt that it would be a non-invasive. I see Judy Zinni's hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention the difference as well in between those two Phragmites is the inflorescence of the native one is not quite as full. And okay. The other, my understanding is that the color of the stems is slightly different. I think it's the native one is a little bit bluer than the non, but the important thing there is that they are both the same species, but different subspecies. So if you wanted to mention it in your schedule, you can't simply say Phragmites australis, you'd have to say subspecies australis as well as being invasive, because the other one is a different subspecies but the same species.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Judy. Next question. If we have the show schedule ahead of the judging and do not see any mention, should we point that out to the show committee? Well, we could point it out, but if the schedule's already been posted, you can't change the schedule in midstream. It means that, yes, bring it to their attention so with future shows, they can understand that. Okay, Pat, we got a couple more questions there.
I think that was it.
Okay, any other comments, any other experiences dealing with invasives on the show table? No?
Judy has her hand up again.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
I'm wondering how far are you thinking that schedule should go as far as lists go, restricting what's on the show table? If we're taking guidance from the government, there's really only 10. Ontario is a big province. Things that are invasive in southwestern Ontario probably aren't a problem up north. And even in, say, the GTA, what really is escaping into, say, the ravines or other areas? How far are you thinking schedules should go? Excellent
question, Judy. One of the problems is as you point out, it depends on where you are in the province. The list of plants that are of concern go well beyond the scope of the legislation. How far do we as an organization want to go in terms of giving advice to societies about how restrictive they can be? I mean, show committees, it's the law of the show. You know, the schedule is the law of the show. If a society decides to say no plants that are found in the following publications, they could list both the legislation, the 2 guidelines that we've talked about. They could include all the plants on the Noxious Weed Act. They could include, you know, whatever.
I guess my concern is you've got such a large list potentially.
Yeah.
First of all, I would feel myself personally, I'd feel uncomfortable making some sort of a scientific edict on something that, you know, I don't think I have the knowledge to do that. But, you know, some lists list things such as, say, English ivy. I know it's not on the native terrestrial plant species, but it is on a number of others. It certainly is in the Grow Me Instead book. So if you limit that and somebody brings a trained heterohelix to the show that is an indoor plant, posts no problem at all to any, you know, escaping and going into any ecological area. Lots of people have it growing on their front wall or their in their garden, myself included. And I can tell you from, and I'm in the GTA, but I can tell you from experience that ivy has 2 stages of growth. It has an immature and a mature stage, and it does not produce any seeds until it's mature. And in the 25 years I've grown it, I've only seen seeds on it 1 year because there's so much winter dieback. So I guess there, and Norway Maple is another thing. How many of us have a Crimson King in our front yard? There are dozens and dozens of cultivars of Norway Maple. Are we going to say to people that they can't use that in a design? They can't put that, clip a branch from their tree and put it into, you know, a show as a horticultural specimen? Where do we draw the line, and how comfortable do we feel drawing that line?
Any thoughts, any comments on Judy's, what she's raised? I mean, she's raised really the crux of it. Where do we as judges, where do we as an organization want to draw the line on what should or shouldn't be listed in an invasive species list? Or do we just leave societies to decide on their own? They have less knowledge likely than most of us.
And that's the great, you know,
Yeah.
sorry to open such a can of worms. This is such a difficult thing. And we also have to remember that we're trying to get exhibitors to our shows. We're trying to be encouraging. And if we make it so difficult, you know, they see a list of 30 plants with botanical names and they throw it in the air and say, I can't do this. This is too difficult. You know, these are all things that are going through my mind around this issue.
I see Denise's hand up, Denise, and then we've got Charlene.
I think as judges, we follow the lead of the Hort Society. We can mention after the show politely that they may want to look at some of these different resources and think about making changes for their next show. But we shouldn't criticize the society for not knowing, nor, like Judy said, we want to encourage people to show. There's a fine line, but we've been asked to judge, not correct the show schedule.
Charlene?
So just, yeah, My friend and I were going to a convention, and I can't remember off the top of my head where it was, but it was further down south than where we are in Deep River. And a plant that I can't even remember what plant it was, but it is planted in gardens here and was taken down to the convention to show, and we were told by the passing committee at the convention that this plant was a weed and they would not put it on the show table, but it wasn't a weed up here. So that was interesting also.
Well, not noxious weeds is a whole nother topic. Again, what's a noxious weed in one part of the province may not be a noxious weed in the other. The legislation lists what are considered noxious weeds in the province of Ontario. And there are obviously within the legislation under noxious weeds, there's the ability of weed inspectors to order people to remove noxious weeds from their property, but is there any harm in a noxious weed showing up on a show table?
I think it was like they considered it just a weed, not necessarily a noxious weed, just a weed, but up here it was a garden plant. Maybe
Okay.
because of the difference in the weather, I'm not sure. Maybe where it's warmer, it would spread more as opposed to here. But it wasn't welcome on the show table, but only because they said they considered it a weed in that area, not a noxious weed, not an invasive weed, just a weed.
Okay, that's an interesting observation.
My comment is, Penny, my comment is a rose by any other name.
Well, exactly. I mean,
Right.
hey, I intentionally grow thistles every year for the goldfinches.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right? In a, wayside design, I might include a beautiful blooming thistle.
Mhm.
If the show schedule doesn't specifically restrict something,
Yeah.
then as a judge, if it's not restricted and the show committee has put it on the table, I guess we deal with it as best we can. Judy.
I was just going to mention, Charlene's comment. It was a convention, and probably the person was well ensconced in various horticultural society comings and goings, but you could be judging at a show where someone's putting something in for the first time, and depending on the experience that they have, it may be the last time they ever enter a show. The other thing I'd like to say is I fully embrace the educational opportunity that we have as judges, that we can talk about native plants and invasive plants. And certainly they could be excluded from being accepted for a plant sale. But I think it's difficult putting together a list for a show schedule beyond what the government says is an actual banned or restricted specimen.
Anne.
I judged, I was chair of the Brampton Convention. And when we were looking at all of the specimens before the judges came in, where we had the display for the butterfly bush, somebody had put in purple loosestrife. So I contacted the show chair, the show chair who was looking after that particular part of it, and mentioned that plant should not be on the table. And they said, oh no, it's a butterfly bush. And I knew darn well it wasn't a butterfly bush. So anyway, I said, well, we'll just put it to the back of the table and it won't be judged, because I will talk to the judge when they come in. Well, this person got a little upset. And I said, well, it's not a butterfly bush, and it shouldn't be in that class. So anyway, after the show, it came out that the person I was talking to was the one who had entered it. And she said it grew in her garden. Of course it grew in her garden because it was invasive. Anyway, those are the things that, that you come across, and you just have to deal with it. And if you're on the show committee and you're not the judge, you need to alert the judge to things like that. And if the judge sees it, they need to alert the show chair that this is why this particular specimen is not being judged.
Exactly. And as you say, or I guess Judy said, it could be someone who has never shown before.
Exactly.
And they bring in this beautiful purple thing that they know attracts butterflies, and it's gorgeous, and I'm going to enter this show. And we have to be very careful, one, that we don't totally discourage an exhibitor, that our comments to that exhibitor don't put that exhibitor off so much that they never enter another show. Because really, we as judges depend on those exhibitors to even be in existence. No shows, there's no need for judges.
Yeah.
I'm just going to quote something. I love Esther Vera Mayhamel. I don't know how many of you enjoy read. I find her book amazing. She makes a little comment about judges' comments on exhibitor cards. Your comments may very well be the obituary of the hopes of any exhibitor who tried and no longer will have the courage to try again. So it's a fine line between educating an exhibitor and turning them off so much so that they just say, well, I'm never coming back again. Why should I bother? So it's a balancing act. As judges, we're sitting there with, we want to make sure that things are done correctly, but we also want to be able to encourage people. So a comment regarding the purple loosestrife that was not a butterfly bush, you would have to be very carefully word your comment so as not to discourage them, and to encourage them to enter again. But again, you have to work with your passing committees and so on to try and help them better understand. Not all societies have the luxury of a passing committee that has perhaps someone on it who is a judge with the years and years of experience that we have as a group.
Penny, you have a couple more questions.
Okay.
What if you don't notice until the judging has already started? Still alert the show chair?
Well, if you haven't started judging that particular class, then yes, you can call the show chair over and say, I haven't started this class, but I can't help but notice there is a problem with one of these entries. Would you and your passing committee like a moment to relook at this class? I don't believe this plant should be in there, but I will give you a moment to do that. Because often you don't see a problem with a class. You walk the show, quickly look at it. The passing committee has gone through it, and then lo and behold, you get to that class, and it doesn't necessarily have to be something like an invasive. It can just be that something got put in the wrong class, and we want to be generous. We want to give opportunities so that the passing committee person can come over and go, oh, sorry, we must have missed that. That shouldn't be under X. It should be over here under Y. Could you give us a moment? We'll just move it. We'll take the tag. We'll let the clerks know. We'll let the registrar know. There, that gives somebody another opportunity to potentially win a ribbon where they might not. They might just get a note saying not according to schedule.
Another one, in the list that you had, Conovrilla was on it. So if it was in a design, would that be wrong, just thinking that flower could be purchased from a wholesaler?
On Valeria,
Thank you.
Lily of the Valley.
Oh, Lily of the, well, see, Lily of the Valley is not on the Ontario prohibited or restricted list. It is only on the list that the Ontario Invasive Plant Council and the Invading Species group, they have recognized it as a potential that they think needs to be focused on, but it's not in the legislation yet. The legislation always tends to lag behind. In 5 years, maybe Lily of the Valley will be on that restricted list. We don't know. I see Lucille's hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself first, Lucille, so we can hear you? There we go.
I'm also wondering about periwinkle. Like, we bought a property. We have a cemetery, a pioneer cemetery behind us, and so there's, like, they used to plant it in the cemeteries. It's actually, another name for it is cemetery grass. And I have to admit, I have used the leaves of the periwinkle like for greenery in an arrangement. So was that the same as Lily of the Valley?
Exactly. It's not on the, there's only 10 plants that are restricted.
So are you saying that we shouldn't be using periwinkle in arrangements?
No, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is those are plants that have been identified as having the potential to be invasive if they escape their natural environment. Unless the show schedule states no periwinkle, no Lily of the Valley, no whatever, then there's no reason to disqualify something that has periwinkle in it, that has goutweed as a greenery. I mean, what would be our reason for restricting its use?
I have goutweed too on my property. I bought the house with goutweed. We've been here for 36 years. It hasn't like spread drastically, nor is the periwinkle. In 36 years, it hasn't really spread that badly. I also have Lily of the Valley.
Well,
so I got 3 of them on the list.
Well, and that again, we have to be very careful how restrictive we want to be. Charlene, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to comment on Lily of the Valley. I ended up with some in my yard from my neighbor's yard, and I tried everything. I could not dig it out. I covered it with black plastic for 6 months, took the plastic off, and those roots were just as healthy as they ever were before I put the plastic down. It's going to end up on that list sooner or later.
Well, that was the whole idea of just, this is one of the topics that people have said, well, how much knowledge do we need as judges? How do we apply this knowledge? There is no clear cut other than the 10 plants that are on the restricted list. Likely should be plants that are restricted in show schedules. But beyond that, it would be up to individual societies to decide whether or not. Now, if you live down in the Windsor neck of the woods, I know that Point Pelee has been overrun with periwinkle. Right? Absolutely overrun. It is very invasive. It's crowding out natives. It's destroying native ecosystems. I live in Kingston on heavy clay soil. I have a little patch of periwinkle that took me 12 years to even get established. It's going nowhere. So this whole idea of invasive, that general term invasive versus the legal description of invasive, it depends on your soil. It depends on your climate. It depends on what controls you have in place. So this is not a clear cut. This is a gray topic, but I think it's a good topic for us to at least be aware of and understand the potential issues that arise. And that was the whole idea behind these judges' updates, is to talk about things that maybe aren't clear cut, because judging isn't clear cut now, is it? Charlene.
Just wanted to say, we have actually Lily of the Valley in our spring show schedule as a horticultural exhibit on the horticulture side on the show table.
Okay, I see a comment here from Connie. I'd like to see Campanula rapunculoid added to the list. Yes, surprisingly enough, that's not one of the ones that any of these organizations have even added to the list. I was surprised not to see it there. It's the bane of my existence. I spend endless hours pulling that stuff out every year, and I just dig and dig and dig, and it comes back every year. The same as, some of you have that same problem with goutweed. I don't. Goutweed doesn't grow well in clay soil. Any other questions or comments? Anne?
Just a second. I sat here so long, I've now forgotten what the question was.
Well,
it was related to Lily of the Valley. Some of our societies have Lily of the Valley as their society flower, right?
That would be me.
That would be you, right?
That's Credit Valley Horticultural Society. That is our emblem.
Yeah.
But
So
you also see the theme now of replacing society flowers with natives or non-invasive type plants. I know I've had 2 in my district that have changed their emblems for non-invasives.
So should we as judges and district directors be encouraging them to change it?
Well, I guess we as judges and district directors maybe want to, have them look at it and say, when you chose Lily of the Valley for your society back in 1902, it wasn't recognized as a problem. In fact, everyone loved Lily of the Valley. But now in 2021, it has been recognized as a plant that can cause serious problems to our natural ecosystem. Maybe we should look to updating our emblem. There's always that resistance to change. Some societies, for historical reasons, we have had a petunia since day one, and there's no way we are going to get rid of the petunia. I think as district directors, you could quietly maybe talk to a society and say, hey, have you had this discussion with your society? Change is difficult and it takes time. But that's an interesting point. Catherine Lindsay.
Hi.
Yeah.
As a former district director for District 2, I think it's a discussion that needs to go on at the OHA board.
Okay. We can bring it to their attention.
Yeah, in terms of, do they want a guiding policy on this?
Okay.
So that district directors don't get put in a position of, one director says one thing and another one says something else or nothing.
Okay.
So I think it needs to be raised to the board level.
Okay. Okay.
The conversation.
Catherine?
I would say we can bring it up at the OHA level, but societies run their own roosts. So it's say a policy is a policy. It's a suggestion. It's
It's a policy.
can't make them do anything.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is that I don't think you want individual district directors
Directors.
to be put on the hot seat, if you will. I agree, Kat. In the end, it's the society's decision. But if it comes down from the provincial organization,
It carries more weight.
correct.
And there's a consistency, which I think the OHA officers and the board want policies and guidelines, which is why, we have policies and guidelines so that there is consistency across the province, so that you don't get an inconsistent approach. But it's certainly something that we could pass along to the OHA board and say, hey, here's something we're wondering with the changing view of invasives and invading species. Should we as an organization perhaps be, as an organization, encouraging societies to rethink their emblems? I don't know. That's a good point that I think we could take forward to the board. And the same thing sort of applies if we say, well, should we as judges have a list of things that we're recommending to societies that they put in their schedule? That again is maybe something that would have to have board support and approval. To say, as a society, here's a list of plants that we as the OHA don't think you should have in your shows, and that we feel you should name as prohibited in shows for the betterment of the environment. But that would again would be a policy or a guideline of the OHA. And as Kat says, societies are independent organizations that the OHA doesn't have a lot of control over in terms of how they do business, as long as they are seen as being members in good standing.
But here's a conversation that maybe the OHA needs to have with OMAFRA. I mean, our funding comes from the province, and the province has guidelines.
The society's funding comes from OMAFRA,
Well,
yes.
and so does ours, or so does the OHA.
OHA,
Oh,
no, OHA doesn't get any direct funding from OMAFRA at all.
no, not a penny.
Not a
Okay.
penny.
So anyway, so maybe, but okay, so if they're funding societies,
8 o'clock.
should OMAFRA have a policy position on this?
Well, yeah, that's interesting. Asking OMAFRA to have a policy on what society should and shouldn't list in their show schedules. I'm sure the response from OMAFRA more than likely will be, we'll just take a look at existing legislation. Use the existing legislation. We don't need a policy. We have legislation in the province of Ontario. The Invasive Species Act, the Noxious Weed Act. There's your guidelines.
It comes from them.
Yeah, I mean,
it's like OMAFRA basically saying, we are supporting societies, and this is our position on things.
Yeah.
So consider it.
Yeah.
Not that they're necessarily going to say they're going to not give them funding, but
yeah. I don't know. I suppose again, that's something we could pass along to the board, and maybe ask the board to consider whether they think there is any merit in asking OMAFRA to put out any guidelines on the use of invasive species by societies in their shows, etc. I don't think it would be high on OMAFRA's list. But, that's just knowing how complex that ministry is and where their focus is. I mean, have a heavy agricultural focus as opposed to show tables. Anyhow, it's just that's a good point. We're having, I think, a very good discussion here. Any last comments on the invasives? There's nothing else in the chat I'm seeing. Oops. So should we start using the term invasive or invading in our rules? Well, invasive are definitely, there's some that are invasive as per legislation, and there are some that are invasive or invading that are more generic, and you could use both terms. The problem with just referring a society show group and telling them go read www.invadingspecies.com is you're asking people at the show level to go in, look at the list, and be able to interpret the list and interpret the interpretation. I mean, if you look actually at the Invasive Species Act, unless you have the experience of reading legislation, reading Ontario legislation such as the Invasive Species Act is difficult. If that's not your background, it's very difficult to go through and determine what is the difference between a prohibitive invasive species, a restrictive invasive species, what can you and can you not do with prohibitive invasive species versus restrictive invasive species. There's different restrictions on them right in the legislation, but can we ask show committees to be interpreting legislation? Charlene.
I think it would be very hard to group everything as well, because what might be invasive, invading, or aggressive in Southern Ontario is certainly is not going to be the same in Northern Ontario. So trying to put the same restriction across the province would be unfair or not the right way to go about it, I don't think.
True. It does make a difference on where you are in the province. Lorraine is
signaling.
Yes.
Hi, I think this has been a very illuminating discussion, and I think it's raised more questions than answers, and it's a good. I think I've heard so many different points and just lots of interesting ways this could go, and it would probably be a good discussion for societies to have at a meeting and just introduce the topic and get a sense from the members about how they feel, because I personally have no idea what the members of my society feel on these matters. I know how I come down on things, but even tonight I've learned so much, and there are no easy answers. So I think it's ripe for further discussion and debate.
Thank you very much. And yeah, as I say, that's the part of doing these types of things, is to get this type of discussion and this type of debate going, so that we can help people. And there is no easy answer. There's no black and white answer to this topic. I'm just glad everyone has enjoyed, and we've just dabbled in it tonight. I mean, we didn't go into a lot of detail. I didn't want to go through the legislation word by word because that's really boring if that's not your cup of tea. I made a living of interpreting environmental legislation and enforcing it. So reading legislation is kind of, old hat for me. But if you don't do that sort of thing, it is difficult to interpret. That's for certain. But yes, I'm hoping that as judges, maybe we can get out there and work with our societies across the province and have these discussions about what are good ideas in terms of what we are doing within our own societies, with our own plantings within societies, with our flower shows within societies. I'm hoping that what comes out of this tonight is people take a closer look at what is a very important topic that is constantly changing. As we learn more about more of these plants, we're going to find that more and more of them in the wrong location in the province of Ontario are going to cause problems. And yes, what's causing problems in Windsor is not necessarily causing problems up in Renfrew County, but we need to all be educated about both our local vicinity as well as the province in general. So I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. I'm going to leave the last few slides I had was on two more topics that I think we can roll into another talk sometime about other things that shouldn't show up on the table, like noxious weeds and cannabis. That's a whole nother talk. I just thought I would have that little bit of extra information there in case the questions came up about it. What I do have is another very short slide presentation. It's looking at the house plants for the virtual show. We had a very in-depth discussion last week about pros and cons of virtual shows, issues, and so on and so forth. So this shouldn't take nearly as long because I think we hit on most of the main points. The idea was basically these the practice judging exercises. The idea was we knew across the province, not all of you have had a chance to actually judge a virtual show. So in looking at the guidelines for virtual shows, if you haven't actually seen, here's a bunch of photos, judge them. You have no idea, what some of the points are in those guidelines. And the idea was to let's look at the issues around virtual judging. We're not here to rehash what the judge decided. You have to keep in mind that the judge was looking at high resolution photos, not PDFs with 3 pictures on a page. So what the judge saw and what we saw in this exercise is not necessarily the same thing. So I would ask that we keep our comments focused on the pros and cons and some of the issues we saw when we looked at these. And we aren't going to revisit what the judge's decision was, because as we all know, the judge's decision is final and it's none of our places to second guess what or why a judge made a decision. We just accept our colleague's decision and we don't look too deeply into them or make comments on them. So I'm just going to bring that second slideshow up. It's only 3 or 4 classes of house plants. Just bear with me while I go back to my share screen function and go back to my okay, I'm just okay. Quick question, Kat. I need to get back to my desktop and I can't minimize Zoom when I'm recording. Can I stop the recording and restart?
I think you can.
Okay, that's what I'm going to do then. soon as I
I'm
find,
being told no by someone in the chat.
I'm
You
being
can
told.
pause it. You can pause it if you want.
Okay, I'm looking for the pause button.
It's near the
Oh,
record button.
there, I got it.
up
I
there.
know, just in a different spot on this machine. Okay, I'm going to pause Zoom recording. Okay. We had three, I think four classes of houseplants that we're going to take a quick look at, but just a quick review. When you're doing virtual shows, keep in mind you could have a colleague participating. If you do recognize their design, their entry, try and be as objective as possible. Keep in mind the overall theme of the show, and class titles, this more applies to design, but remember that it's only 10 points for theme and interpretation. Questions arose last week about, how much advance notice. As a judge, you should be given notice well in advance. You should get that show schedule well in advance so that you can talk to people on the show committee and ask them questions about how they want this virtual show judged, because it's different than an in-person show. There may be questions that arise out of a virtual show schedule that requires you to go back to the show people and say, okay, what did you mean by this? I don't really understand. Is there a concern about honorariums? Just like any other show, should be arranged in advance. The schedule is hopefully written to help exhibitors submit good photos, but keep in mind that we do our best not to judge the photography, just the design or just the houseplant. And we all recognize, and there was a huge discussion last week about how difficult it is when you don't have a good photograph of that design or a good photograph of that houseplant. Backgrounds, be lenient on backgrounds. A lot of people had to make do with what they had available. Sometimes finding a totally empty wall or a good backdrop, neutral backdrop, can be really difficult if you are not used to taking photographs. You don't have all those props available to you. So there's a certain need to be lenient and try not to judge it as whether it's a good or not a good photo. Write good comments. It's important because sometimes the results are published on social media. Sometimes people looking at it will gain knowledge from reading them. Just like when people go around to the show and they look at your little comments on the tags, they go, oh, is that what they mean when they're talking about? It's an educational thing. Someone asked the question, well, how much time should you be given to judge a virtual show? It's very time consuming. Those of you who have done fairly good size shows will know that. 7 to 10 days is what we're saying is reasonable, depending on the size of the show, because it takes a lot of extra time to fill in the forms, because you're doing all the clerking. When you're judging a virtual show, not only are you judging, making comments, but you're filling in all the clerking sheets. So it's a lot of extra work. And decisions of judges are final, as always. And the OHA virtual show guidelines are on the OHA website. It does give people show schedule suggestions, tips on photography. Be familiar with that particular guideline. This is a sample I sent out to people. This might be how you get your list of classes sent to you. this one in particular is in an Excel spreadsheet. You may get it in Word, you may get it in whatever. So just remember, you may have to be dealing with different software that you may or may not be familiar with. And each society is going to have a different way of presenting the information that you have to fill in. So bromeliads. We had 4 entries in this class. I think if you look across these pictures, you will immediately see that exhibitor 11A looks like they took the photograph sitting on the kitchen counter. The background, very distracting. There's shadows, makes it a little more difficult to really focus in on the plant material. Exhibitor 11B, obviously the same exhibitor. Hort classes, you're allowed 2 entries per class. Again, they had the same issue of lighting, which again, you have to be as lenient as you possibly can be. Exhibitor 13 cropped the plant a little bit. Let's be lenient on that. They, put it on a nice tablecloth and tried to put a neutral background behind it. So what, and again, you're not looking at as high a quality photos here as the judge did when the judge did this show, but here's what the judge found. Exhibitor 19, the beautiful bromelid in bloom, looking very crisp, was first. The bromelid that few ends cropped off felt was the second place. Nice, clean, well-maintained looking plant. Third place went to exhibitor 11A and honorable mention to 11B. So, I mean, judging a house plant, you're up against the same issues. You don't have the depth of field. You can't see the details of the edges of the leaves, the condition of the plant. So depending on the quality of the photographs you got, it can be really, really difficult to judge a houseplant. Orchids. Here we have a Phalaenopsis orchid. You can see the different backgrounds again. Exhibitor 5, exhibitor 19, put them on nice plain backgrounds, minimal shadows. Exhibitor 11, again, the same issue of a little bit of shadows and lighting. And exhibitor 20, fairly neutral background. The brick wall, not as distracting if you're looking at a house plant as it would be if you were looking at a design. But again, you're having to work with what you have. And although not ideal, getting people out to enter virtual shows is better than no shows at all. And there are times and places for virtual shows, even moving forward. We know virtual shows allow people who maybe can't travel, would give them the opportunity to enter a show. So here we have the 2 most floriferous orchids, took first and second place. Third place to the third pink orchid there, and honorable mention to the pale yellow one. Exhibitor 5, a less floriferous, not as well presented orchid. Sansevieria, bird's nest. Only 3 entries here. Again, different backgrounds. You have to try and not see the background, not see the shadows, and try and judge the plant on its cultural perfection. So first went to the Sansevieria in the center, looking very well groomed, no signs of browning or tips. Lighting is reasonably good. I mean, good use of a at-home backdrop and foreground. The other 2, as not as large a plants, interesting varieties. Second place, third place. That one I thought was fairly straightforward and easier to judge. And lastly, cactus. Here we have, Again, you can get large numbers of specimens on the table. You can get large number of specimens in virtuals, and you're up against the same problem. How do you look at them? How do you decide from a purely cultural perfection point of view which is going to be the one that you give first, second, or third? Here we've got fairly neutral backgrounds, so that is not as big an issue. All of these are in pretty good focus. Of an unfocused houseplant, very hard to judge an unfocused houseplant, but you do your very best with what's presented to you. This is a class of a cactus. In this case, first prize went to the cactus that was actually in bloom. A nice looking question. A question from Judy.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention exhibit number 19, the second one in.
Yeah.
Is not a cactus.
Thank you. Okay.
And I have actually come against this in a show where this exact specimen, two of them, as a matter of fact, were in the cactus class. The show schedule did not allow for grafted cacti. So we took it out of the cactus class, put it in the succulent class. It's a Euphorbia lactea cristata. It's a crested type, and it absolutely cannot live on its own, and it must be grafted. It's grafted onto a different type of Euphorbia. So that's how we got around it. And the exhibitors were thrilled because they actually got a ribbon.
Okay. Okay. Very good. Looking across these cactus, we got, you know, a wide range. It's sort of like any other variety. Very different cactus. Again, we're looking for cultural perfection.
You have another
Oops.
hand up.
Oh. Okay, who next?
Karen?
Sorry, I was just going to say the same thing.
Okay.
That number 19 was a euphorbia. Sorry.
Yes. Okay. And that would be a comment you might want to make or a note you might want to make on the sheets that you sent back to the show chair saying, you know, oh, by the way, in class 13 under cactus, one of these exhibits was in fact not a cactus, it was a euphorbia. And that way you educate the show person. Catherine Lindsay, you've got your hands up.
You've also got Mary waving.
Okay. Kathy Lindsay first. Kathy, you still with us from the Yucatan? Okay, well, let's go on.
Okay, no, here I am.
Gotcha now.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So my understanding is that in the cactus class, a bloom does not give extra points because it is so ephemeral.
Okay.
So I would not like to see a comment that exhibit 11A got first because it was in bloom.
Okay. Okay. There were no comments made on these by
So, you know, so there you go.
Okay.
Even spent blooms for that matter, which you can actually leave on a cactus.
Okay.
They for exhibiting, they're not to count for extra points. Is my understanding of the current guidance in OJS.
Okay, and we have two more raised hands.
You had Mary Cameron first.
Mary?
I questioned 11A too, and this was one of the problems with virtual. Those blooms look too large. I questioned whether they weren't glued to the cactus. If you in a virtual, or if you had a show, a regular show, you would recognize that right away. But being virtual, I couldn't tell.
There's no perspective here. You can't tell whether that's a 3-inch cactus in a pot or whether that's a much larger cactus in a pot because there's no point of reference. We talked about this last week, that if there's no reference point, sometimes things like miniatures, how do you tell whether it in fact, what the perspective is you're looking at? The other thing I will comment on is what you're seeing here is one photo of each plant. In the actual show, the judge got 2 photos of each houseplant, but that became very cumbersome for the purpose of this particular exercise. Sending 2 photos of every entry is a lot of extra work. And the idea was to do what we're doing here was just get some comments and stimulate some interest. Some good points, one about the euphorbia and 2 about the fact that the blooms on the cactus don't necessarily automatically make it first place. I see a couple more hands there, Kat.
You got Judy.
Yeah, I was just going to note about the blossom. It does say, just open flowers on a succulent do not automatically raise it to an award level, but I would say it does indicate that the plant is happy and that the person who's growing it is doing a good job with the culture. So I wouldn't say that you necessarily discount it. And the reason that we allow spent blossoms to remain on a cactus is that with many varieties, many species, if you pull that withering blossom off the cacti, you will permanently damage the body of the cactus. And that's why you don't necessarily, you wouldn't discount it if you see a withering blossom on something on the show table on a cactus.
Okay. One more hand there, Kat. I can't see the actual hands when I got the slide show up. So
Sharon Gardner.
Okay.
Okay, sorry. If you zoom in on exhibit 2, you can see there is a insect hanging on the right-hand side. I don't know if it's a spider or just a web, but you can definitely see it when you zoom in.
Okay.
That's all.
Okay.
Ann Arbor.
And
Just have to unmute. Yeah, I was going to mention about the spent blooms and the reasons why you leave them on.
Okay.
Judy did it ahead of me.
Okay, great. Yeah, we don't want to damage a cactus. If you can get a cactus to bloom, you don't really want to in any way, shape, or form cause it any permanent damage. I've yet to ever get a cactus to bloom in my lifetime, so I'm not a great succulent or cactus grower. Any other comments on the cactus class?
That's all that's showing.
That's all that's showing. Okay.
I just want.
And here's the results. Just if you're going back to look at this slideshow, you fill in the results. You see the column that says notes. That's where under cactus 1 specimen, you could put a note in exhibit 19 is not a cactus, should not have been in this class, is a succulent. Or you could put a note like that in your email back to the passing committee. And you had one more comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say for the tall cactus in the bottom left-hand corner, just for awareness, it's etoliated. It hasn't grown properly. And a lot of people say, oh, well, look how great that's growing now. But no, if it's growing in and then out again, it isn't, it hasn't had good
growing conditions.
Good growing.
Consistent growing conditions, I guess.
Yeah, it hasn't been growing consistently.
Consistently. Right. Okay. So again, this is basically how you would fill this in. You would make your notes. You would ship this back off to your show chair, and they would continue on. So there is a lot of extra work involved from the clerking point of view if you are judging a virtual show. And that is the end of that short show. So I think, are there any other general comments on virtual show judging? I'd be interested in maybe hearing for a few minutes from people who have judged virtual shows to find out what they found the most challenging.
For me, it was the photography. That you don't have consistent photos taken at consistent angles. They're all over the place. Judy has her hand up.
Judy?
For the horticultural specimens, I found it's difficult. It's difficult to determine the form, say, of a houseplant or the aspect of something in a cut specimen, because often the show only requires you to send in one photo. It may or may not say from the front, but in certain, with a houseplant, you might want to see it from the front. You might want to see it also from the
top,
a bird's eye view. And so some schedules now are asking for multiple views.
Sharon Garner.
I was just going to add to that when you're putting out the competition schedule, you could mention about photography tips in terms of reduced shadows, contrasting tabletop or background without clutter, and just in a vertical and a horizontal view, just so that you can get a full picture of the specimen.
Yeah,
it's a good teaching moment to give photography tips.
If you look at the OHA virtual show schedules, at the very end of those guidelines, there is a whole list of tips. And the idea is, if you know somebody doing up a virtual show, make sure they have a copy of those guidelines and tell them to pass those tips along as part of the show schedule. And then folks who are new to this can read through it and can try out some different things, so you do get better quality photos. That is one of, Kat mentioned photography, no consistent photos. I judged a show, and the varying degrees of perfection in the photographs were really, really apparent. There are some that looked like they had been taken by somebody who photography was a serious hobby. The lighting was set up. The backdrop was just perfect. The photos were super crisp. And then others were a little bit fuzzy, shadows. So it became very hard not to be judging the quality of the photo. I think that was the biggest challenge.
Penny? I win. I had the one with the hubby in the underwear in the background.
The what? Okay, you got to tell us this story, Kat. That's a humorous way to end off this meeting.
They needed to zoom a little more on the plants and not give such a wide view. It was interesting. He was sitting cutting a sandwich in his jockeys. Yeah. Thanks anyway.
Thank you, Kat. That's just priceless.
No road stripe. You have a question? So how are honorariums set for judges on a virtual versus an in-person?
That is between you and the show group. Keep in mind, just because it's virtual and you're not traveling to the show table, it doesn't mean it's less work. You've got all of the issues of dealing with the software, of filling in forms online, of resending all those forms back. So don't, have the same discussion you would have with your show committee if you were showing up in person?
Hi, it's Kathy. I asked that question.
Kathy. Oh, okay.
Because I think it is a lot more work.
Oh, yeah, I would agree.
And so for societies, and Penny, you have experience with this, to offer the same honorarium, it to me is not actually, well, it's something to be discussed.
Yeah.
Because it is more work. You're clerking, you're dealing with photographs, you're having to spend more time looking at the entries than you would necessarily when you would be doing it in person. And so I think that you know, there's maybe something to be said there for, you know, level of effort, or compensation for level of effort.
I definitely think that a lot of them want to knock you down because you're not traveling there. And no, it's not like doing a Zoom. It could be cheaper for you to do a Zoom a little cheaper because you're not traveling, you don't have the extra time. But really, you've done hours on a presentation, and you've have to sit through their meeting, and it's totally different.
Yeah,
I agree, and I think that's something we should be discussing.
Mm-hmm.
So
Can I just pipe in for a sec?
Yeah, who's there?
Just on the flip side of that is, I just think we need to be sensitive right now. A lot of the hort societies have had a tough couple of years. They've not been able to fundraise. So just a little sensitivity around it. I know it's a big job. I've done a few virtual shows, and it is hours of work for sure. But just a comment.
Yeah. Yeah, if you know the society and you know their circumstances, you may want to be, you know, reduce your fee, do it for free, whatever your relationship is with that society. Not all societies lost money in the pandemic. Some of them did okay. But you know your local society is likely better than others. Ann Harbert.
I have to say, in the 2 years of doing COVID virtual shows, I never got paid for a virtual show or a judging update or anything else, because we're not supposed to ask for fees. It's only if they say this is the fee we would like to present to you. So it's really out of our hands.
No,
it's up to the society.
Well, I don't know. I don't know that I 100% agree with that. I mean, I think it's clear that an honorarium has to be determined between the judge and the show committee in advance.
Well, we also were told, Penny, not to ask for money or an honorarium.
By who and when?
When I went through judging school. And it was something that, yes, you know, the societies, if I do anything in person, I always get paid. But I have not been paid for all of the things that I have done virtually in 2 years.
Penny, you have a question in the chat. Our society sets the honorarium and just gives it without a discussion. Personally, feel it's low, but as a judge, do you negotiate it?
Well, I personally don't negotiate. I have often, if asked what my honorarium is to do a show, I will say, well, I will leave it to your committee to decide what you think is reasonable and that you can afford. And I will accept whatever honorarium they offer. That is how I have done it.
You have Denise with her hand up, and Charlene and Lil.
Uh,
Happy birthday, Will.
Denise,
Like Anne, I was taught not to ask for money. I have done live shows and not been paid. I've been given lunch as payment. So I think it's something as judges we need to bring to our own societies and make sure that they're aware of these situations before the shows even get started.
okay. Who's next, Kat? I can't see the order of operation from here.
That was Denise, so the next one would be Charlene.
So I agree with Anne also. In our judging school as well, we were told that you do not ask for payment. If they pay you, great. And if they don't, well, you're not supposed to say anything. And that's for live shows. I organize one of our shows in our society, and I always, when I book the judge, I always say, this is what we normally give. Is that enough? Does that work for you? But yeah, I have to agree with Anne. We were told not to ask.
I was the same way, not to ask, but I have asked when there's nothing in the contract, do you have an honorarium? Not asking for the money, just asking for clarification. And that way you can decide that if it's not something you want to do, then you don't do. But at least get all know what you're getting into.
Okay.
Next one is Lil.
Okay, Lil.
My comment, I have two actually. I agree with the others. We've always been taught that an honorarium is what the society can afford, and I make sure that I'm involved in the decision of what judges get paid, and I make sure that it's more than our society thought that they were going to pay. My second point was concerning the time judging virtual shows, and I've done several, is that I consider the paperwork section to be my driving time. Because as we all know, you're never lucky enough to be driving in the, or to be judging in the society immediately next door. So sometimes you can be driving an hour there and an hour back. Well, that's 2 hours of time. And, you know, most of us, just by the very fact that we're here on Zoom, have over the last 2 years become pretty proficient with technology. Not as proficient as my husband thinks I should be, but, you know, we're getting there. So there is the time factor. So yes, we should be recompensed certainly for all of our time. Whether it's live or virtual, there's still those hours.
Okay, I'm just going to draw people's attention to OHS, page 10. It's the second 3 points under inviting judges. An honorarium, which may include travel or other expenses, should be agreed upon by the show committee and the judge at the time of invitation.
So I agree. You know, I don't think saying, so what is the honorarium is unreasonable, which is why I asked this question. And now you've got virtual, which has other, you know, time commitments and level of effort. So I'm finding it odd that recent guidance is that you can't talk about that.
Well, all I'm saying, I'm just purely quoting OHS, which says it should be agreed upon by the show committee and the judge at the time of invitation, which means there would have to be some form of discussion about honorarium.
Denise has her hand up.
Denise?
I think that was added to OJS this time around, and not all the clubs have read it yet.
Okay, I would have to go back and pull an old copy of OJS, which I don't keep with me.
Not a problem, but I think that
Okay.
that's been added in, which is wonderful.
Okay. Well, maybe that's something we need to make sure gets out to as a reminder. Maybe it's something we can throw in the newsletter as a reminder, you know, please take note under the section in OJS under invited judges that discussing honorariums, although may have been discouraged in the past, is now been stated in OJS to be an acceptable practice. Who else have we got in the chat, Kathy or Kat?
Penny?
Yeah.
I've just checked the old OJS and it has the same phrasing for honorariums, even though it's not something that you ask for. You might ask, is there one? But I don't think, and that's how you bring up the discussion. When I was hiring judges for my club, I would always tell the judge that I was hiring how much the honorarium was, so that they could then make the decision to say, oh, I'm sorry, but I can't that night. I've got another assignment or something. So it's not about the money.
Perfect, Heike. Perfect.
Perfect. That's a good way of saying, that's a good way of doing it. We also need to check on the language in the judging school documentation. Okay, I'm just putting a little asterisk and saying, let's check with Jim. Jim couldn't be here tonight. He had to run some elections. Okay, from Nancy Cole, I often judge country fairs, and they ask me if the honorarium is fair. Most shows I've judged, they've said our honorarium is X. Is that good with you? And I've always said yes. Or my standard line is I will accept whatever honorarium that you're offering and leave it with them, knowing that they will, you know, based on their financial ability. Different societies have different abilities to pay.
No other hands? No
other hands. Well, have we had enough fun for one night? Raised enough questions. I'm hoping that everybody who has been on these past 2 weeks will please, I'm not going to run a poll. I didn't get as far as learning how to do polls on Zoom. That'll be my next training session. Please send us an email to ohajudges@gmail.com. Let us know what you liked about these sessions, what you didn't like about them, and what topics do you want covered, so that we as a OHA committee can look and see, okay, this was actually, you know, first time we've done virtual. So we were not sure how well people would participate, what they would get out of it. So please let us know so we can move forward. I think our plans are, there is no convention this year, so we won't be doing a judges update at convention because there's no convention. But I think the committee was looking at doing this again sometime in the fall. So let us know if that would be good. And what do you want us to talk about? Give us some time to research it so that we can put together slideshows. The slideshows from last week and this week will get posted just as PDF slideshows. As well, we will get the video recordings up so that people can follow the whole talk, but that takes a bit of time because we do have to do the odd bit of editing and so on, and we're all volunteers. So bear with us. We will get the information up to those who couldn't make it tonight, but thank you very much from the entire OHA judging committee for coming out, participating, and learning more.
Thank you very much. That was excellent.
I'm glad everyone could make it tonight, or a fair number of you made it, and I'm hoping those that maybe